You might have never heard the name of a gentleman named Pierre Eugène du Cimetière, but Pierre was responsible for something that almost every one of us carries around with us every day, or has in our home, or in our car, maybe in the cup holder. We see Pierre's legacy prominently displayed practically every day on the news. Even if it's in the background, it's still there. So Pierre Eugène du Cimetière was born in Geneva, Switzerland in 1737 and moved to the American colony of New York in 1763. He earned his living making charts, silhouettes, and painting portraits. And he moved to Philadelphia in 1772 and became a curator of the American Philosophical Society. And there he met and became friends with the likes of Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, and Thomas Paine. In 1776, Pierre was appointed to serve on committees that were established by the Continental Congress to design what would become the Great Seal of the United States. It was Pierre who suggested a certain Latin phrase for that seal, a motto that would sum up the spirit and the goal and the cause of what those very different colonies were doing together in creating a new nation, independent of Great Britain. A new concept no one had ever dared before. Now, among the colonists, there were huge differences in geography, in their economies, in their religions, in their attitudes about slavery, and in their ability to trust each other enough to form some kind of government that would work for everybody. Back in the Revolutionary days, each colony really saw itself as an independent political entity, each with its own sovereign territory, its own laws, its own way of doing things, and their first task was to decide what it even meant to declare independence. Unity was not going to be easy, but they had to come together if they hoped to stand a chance against the British Empire. So Pierre suggested the motto, E Pluribus Unum, out of many, one. So kids, those words are on every coin, like this dime, and piece of paper money that your mom or your dad, your grandma or your grandpa may still carry around in their pockets or purses. You got to explain these things to the young ones, you know. And so next week, we'll also be talking about other obsolete things like DVDs. Not really. Well, a motto is only as good as the will of the people whom the motto represents, right? E pluribus unum, quite honestly, has not been something the United States has always lived up to very well. The Civil War being the most obvious example. So from time to time, the idea of out of many, one is something we've really struggled with. Many would say we're still struggling with it. And it especially comes to the fore during an election year. The question of how best to get people who have very different ideas to work together to pursue one thing, well, that idea has been around forever. And that's assuming, though, that the many people share a common goal to begin with. The goal, the purpose, the reason for being, the cause must be clearly defined and understood and agreed upon. So for the American revolutionaries, it was independence from England. Practically from the very moment the first followers of Jesus got together to organize a church, they were dealing with their common cause. None of us should have any illusions about that. It is right there in the Bible. The New Testament book of Acts is the story of how many people worked together, but they had a big problem. At first, they could not agree on a common goal, purpose, or cause. They could not say, out of many, one, because they had no one thing they agreed on. Now, the majority of them believed that their reason for being was to convince and convert other Jews to accept that Jesus was the Messiah. And that was a very tall order because it was the understanding among Jews that the Messiah would be a person who would assume political and military power and rule over a restored kingdom of Israel. That's a Messiah. But the early Christians were claiming that instead, the Messiah had been a charismatic teacher and healer from Nazareth named Jesus, who had been completely at odds with the Jewish religious leaders and experts in Jewish laws and customs, and who'd been executed shamefully in that brutal Roman way of crucifixion. Nonetheless, his followers were making the outrageous claim that he had risen from the dead, had appeared to them, was present with them now in a spiritual sense, and would be returning any day now to take the throne. So for the average Jew, that whole notion was just absurd and blasphemous. But as time went on, other early Christians began believing that this message was not intended to be strictly for Jewish people, but for all people. So that meant the Gentiles, people the Jews did not particularly care for. They had different customs from each other. They didn't share the same religious beliefs. They dressed differently. They had different dietary practices and laws, on and on. The differences between them were huge. So the very goal the early Christians were pursuing was anything but united. Before the leaders of the group reluctantly agreed to let some members try their hand at talking with Gentiles, it took some gigantic changes of heart, not to mention some rather impressive visions and events that seemed to indicate that maybe they were supposed to be reaching out to people that they'd never imagined reaching out to before. And that was really revolutionary. And that's when people like the Apostle Paul began traveling around the Roman Empire. Since he was a Jew, everywhere he went, he stopped at the local synagogue to share this message. And predictably, most Jews did not receive Paul very warmly, but some did. And in those places, on the fringes at least, Gentiles began hearing and responding and joining those congregations where previously only Jews had been allowed to belong. Not hard to imagine that kind of scene today. Picture a quaint country church holding worship on Sunday. Nicely dressed folks sitting quietly in pews, singing familiar beloved hymns they've known since childhood, all of their sacred traditions and practices, the familiar words spoken, the patterns and sights and sounds of things feeling just right and proper. Even the kind of food they might share at a potluck lunch would be counted on to be consistent. You know, when I was growing up, a certain woman in my church always made the same thing for potlucks without fail: lime green jello with pineapple chunks and walnuts embedded in the jello, just floating there. She used a bundt cake pan to mold it, and she added this wonderful layer of cream cheese at the bottom. I loved that concoction. And if she had not brought that to a potluck, which was unimaginable, it just would not have been a genuine church potluck. We just would have called the whole thing off. So imagine that kind of church, and suddenly a big group of people riding extremely loud Harley-Davidson motorcycles pulls up and parks just wherever they please, even parking those noisy things right there on the grass that was planted in memory of good old Bob Dithers, whose family, after all, gave the money for the baptistry. And all these people bursting into the church wearing blue jeans and boots and bandanas and leather vests, with beards and sunglasses and tattoos covering them, and they crowd in next to you in the pews and they start wanting to sing a rock and roll version of In the Garden, and they refuse to sit quietly. They even laugh out loud sometimes during worship, and they keep coming back. You can just hear the church people talk. We're not sure they've all gone through confirmation class, and now they want to serve on committees, and they want us to do a toy drive and ride around town like common hooligans on their big loud motorcycles, when everybody knows that we only do the annual turkey dinner to support the Christmas Decor Fund. We'll just see about that. The gall of those people, the very idea. Who did they think they are? Coming in and changing everything. This was our church. And what kind of minister would even allow that, much less welcome them with open arms? That kind of scene was played out time and again in the first century communities that Paul visited, and where he invited Gentiles in to mingle with the Jews. Those folks had to learn to get along together, to adopt the motto, E Pluribus Unum, and as long as they agreed on and stayed focused on what the Unum part was, what their goal was, they tended to do okay. However, it's obvious that many of those congregations did not keep their focus, and that it is exactly why we have Paul's letters in the New Testament in the first place. Because in one way or another, every single one of Paul's letters are a reminder to those early people of faith that it simply does not matter what kind of person rolls up to your church on Sunday morning. If you're all tied up in knots because things are changing at church, if worship doesn't feel quite the same, if you feel like the old comfortable traditions are not being respected or held on to, if all the new people are altering the look and feel of things, then the odds are pretty good that you are not focused on what really matters. You're not grasping the big picture, the goal, the purpose, the reason for being, the cause we're all in together, and that is simply this. And it's exactly what the earliest followers of Jesus came to realize, and it's the reason why the early church became the huge phenomenon it did. It was just this. It was to share the good news that God loves you no matter what, that you are accepted here no matter who you are or where you've been, and that God's love has no limits and that everyone belongs. That is a radically inclusive and welcoming and relevant message and reason for being. It's universal. It applies to any place, any time, and anyone. So by its very nature, it is constantly evolving because things change in the world. And the particular genius of the Christian church through history has been its ability to change and adapt to its time and place and the people it serves. Now, on the other hand, it's human nature that when we form groups of any kind, we develop ways of being that become intertwined with what we believe. We associate form with function. And those ways of being are like the clothes that we put on. They define us in an outward sense, and they become more comfortable with age. But ways of being can, unintentionally, become so associated with our reason for being that we can't separate the two. That's why the earliest Christians fought over things like what kind of food was appropriate to eat. In his letter to the Romans, Paul told those people, you're missing the point. Diversity, having many people of many types who may prefer many different types of food, is a good thing, guys. Who cares about stuff like that when your reason for being, the one thing that should be unifying you, is simply to share the good news of God's love for all people? Because when you lose sight of that and you insist on defining yourself by your ways of being rather than your reason for being, you're shutting different people out rather than welcoming them in. Usually not on purpose, but nonetheless, you're putting up walls where there should be open doors. Our doors are open. And that reason for being is what unites us. It's what makes many one. Our goal, our purpose, our cause is powerful. And it's still revolutionary. To welcome any and all, to create a community of diversity and inclusion like no other, and to live out together the truth of God's unlimited love for all people.